Good afternoon or good morning, and welcome to our first event in the discussion series titled Exploring Platform Alternatives and Shaping a Responsible Future. So my name is Alina Kontareva, and I'm a senior researcher at the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society, and I'm also a co-lead at the INCA project. INCA is a Horizon 2020 project, and it stands for Increased Corporate Political Responsibility and Accountability of Digital Platforms. And it's my pleasure to be a moderator for this session today, and I hope that we have more people joining in the discussion. So before we begin, I have to inform you that we are recording this event for public use because we plan to post this video to be stored at the YouTube channel of the INCA project, INCA research project. A couple of words about this discussion series. So we designed this discussion series to address a range of questions concerning the power of digital platforms, their practices, their business models, and also the objective is to explore alternatives to existing platform arrangements that will combine technological innovations, but also appeal to the values of the European society. So we plan to unpack various dimensions of alternatives, including their business models, the corporate governance structure, how platforms create technological innovations, and the role of state, and also the national dimension of platform alternatives. Another objective for our discussion series is also to gather a community of scholars and practitioners who explore the potential of platform alternatives. And it would be great if we could, if you could share a couple of words, a keyword, your research interests in the chat. That would be really interesting for the sake of community building to see who is present in this discussion. So today we have invited wonderful speakers who will open up the discussion series. And today we invited to discuss the role of community efforts in platform organizing and to hear more about the platform governance and the option of self-moderation and open source as an alternative platform strategy. So let me introduce the speakers today. Christina Dinar is a junior researcher for platform governance at Leibniz Institute for Media Research, Hans Bredow Institute. She specializes in community-involved content moderation practices and user participation perspectives. Martin Kenny is a distinguished professor at the University of California, Davis, and a senior project director at the Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy. Martin has written and co-authored extensively on platform economy, platform entrepreneurship, and platform competition. So Christina and Martin kindly agreed to share their ideas, and thank you both for being here with us today and sharing your insights. I suggest we first listen to the both presentations and then have a discussion round. So we will begin with Christina's presentation, right? Christina, please, the digital floor is yours. Please share your presentation.
Oh, that's the end. Sorry. Yeah, thank you very much for giving me space. This is actually really thanks to the Hans Bredow Institute, who supported me 2.5 years to do this research that I will show you about. I am kind of moving forward to a different topic, which has something to do with the studies, but I'm still very grateful for the opportunities I had. So I will introduce you to small tech. That is the research that I did on smaller platforms. And we quickly go through it. So I will show you the research motivation and the scope of the research that we planned. Actually, big thanks to Matthias Kettermann, who can't be here today, but who really gave me the chance to do so. Then I will look at the context of the content moderation and the different context models, the studies results, the regulation that we currently in Europe have concerning these small tech companies and what it actually means. And from it also has a lot to do with the way they position themselves. And then I will kind of open up thoughts. It's more tensions or idea on whether small tech is, or where on what point small tech is or can be an alternative to so-called big techs. So the kickoff of this research was actually 2021 in the so-called super election year. And that project then was called Niche Platforms. And my job at that time was to actually look at the way that other than big tech, what kind of, how do they regulate electoral content, and in what way do they actually support a specific electoral content? I found very quickly that this niche platform term didn't work for them, and these platforms that I interviewed, they didn't like it. So I moved into the term small tech, which I will explain you then. And then after that study was finished, we launched a further development into this small tech section about the question of user courts and the community involvement in content moderation. Our question was more, okay, what is democratic content moderation? And we noticed that the state regulation was very, very busy with big tech or very large online platforms, as we call it. There was a big discussion also in the US at that time about regulating internet by size, and what size, what numbers should it be. And that our goal was to create best practices to show resilience, or maybe also demonstrate very democratic ways of user involvements. Then we had a part, which I won't speak so much about, but just to mention it to you, about whether social media council or user courts are a good legal advisory board instrument in making it more democratic and making it more user involved concerning rules. And then in the end, we always had the question, what actually means democratic, and what does it mean to the communities and the platforms that we look at? Here you see some of the platforms. I must say, very important, that I only looked at German-speaking platforms, which were based in Germany, Austria, or Switzerland. That was the specific hope coming out of this question of regulating through the Bundestagswahl, through the election. Another part of it was that we had, since 2018, the Network Enforcement Act. The Network Enforcement Act was one of the first measures to try to regulate platforms in order to take down content that was considered hate speech. And interestingly, that from the beginning had the numbers that it only concerned social media platforms with over 2 million accounts or users in Germany. So these platforms that you see here, most of them never went into this regulation phase in Germany that was before the Digital Services Act. But they kind of looked at it, of course, in a specific way, and it made them act and think also along. Not all of these platforms I interviewed, but quite a bit of them, and they all fall under what I call the small tech. So on the right, you see the small tech. I did to conduct 13 interviews, 7 from community management or policy teams of one of these platforms, and 6 from communities themselves that I was redirecting. And my incentive was to look at the participation. So the small tech comes from the big tech in a way, from regulating, that they developed kind of all their own rule system or their own perspective on regulation. They are all part of medium and small segment of the platform economy or the German economy. They serve a specific interest that makes them, or that made them, the niche platform that are called before that. All of them kind of survived in the market because they served specific, they had a specific focus and user base. Some of them were from the early 2000s, founded in different phases. So, and some of them kind of came then later in 2010, 11, 12, 16. They all are locally answered. They have a high compliance to the German values and the so-called Mittelstand. So they were actually quite conscious of where they are and also what they wanted to comply to. The GDPR, for example, was for all of them. They all had the servers here. They all complied to the data protection laws in Germany that had already been there. They all have community-involved content moderation. They interestingly also have partly, and if we look at technical development, they develop their own scraping and AI tools for content and for content moderation. They do that in-house with themselves, with their own data that they create. Sometimes that is a decision also because otherwise they would need to collaborate with a big tech company and pay a very high price or a specific high price to get specific data in order to take down specific content, such CSAM or so. So that's also interesting that at one point the price became so high that they have decided to look at it in an in-house development. And yeah, as often in the discussion, they were not in the view of the regulation, not at all, but they kind of were affected from it, and that my study showed also. So they developed their own ideas. So in order to maybe, this is no biggie. I hope I don't know. I hope to see something. To look at the content moderation models, it's very important for me to really make a point. Okay, what is big tech content moderation and what is small tech content moderation? Because these two categories are very important. I go here with Robin Kaplan, who did 2008 big studies and who developed these kind of categories. So she calls this in an industrial decision factory what big tech has. So it has a high employee rates around the world. It has a very formal, systematic, policy-guided factory life moderation. The moderated labor time are kept under surveillance tracked, and there's also many reports and issues about these kind of moderating workers, which I can't say here, and the content is usually pre-filtered. We have the trusted flagger as part of civil society. And actually, regulation addresses exactly this industrial content moderation because we don't have individual weighing. We have a lot of, massive moderation. So in comparison to that, small tech platforms do work with so-called artisanal or community-reliant models. That means they have a small team between 5 to 200. Most of the ones I looked at have about 20 to 60 moderators that work 24/7. They are seated in Germany. They are supervised. They are well staffed. The content moderation decisions are weighed and function by a case-to-case basis. The content moderation they are employed by the company themselves or the platform. And they have an easier time, of course, to adapt into cultural context and decision makers. Even though that is a higher cost for these platforms, they do prefer these models because it kind of takes a lot of, I would say later, it prevents a lot of hate speech and online behavior that is not pleasant. They also work with a mixed hybrid form. So they have community around them that will help them to moderate. And this multi-layered model is like an onion. So inside the onion layer is the paid team by moderators. And usually around them, they have 20 who will have specific rights and they can take down content themselves that are volunteers. They all sign in NDAs and GDPR notices, even though they are not paid. And then you have about 100, 200 layered around that. If they see content, they can flag it. They can move it very quickly to the paid community moderators by the platform. They have a less use of AI, yes, and the decisions are usually also made within the community. There is more transparency, and there's also a high possibility of a user becoming a moderator or gaining a quite similar status like a paid moderator if they want to. So these are the two differences. And the studies results showed that the community participation often led to an increased identification of the users with the platforms and the rules and the readjusting of it. So this Ukraine war, COVID-19, that they actually, the community teams decide then that they will change community standards, but the employment will be done by community mostly, and they will also explain why now rules have changed and why specific content cannot be posted. So they're kind of a social normative carrier to the change of the community rules. The small tech platforms, they also differ in the variety and methods of active or passive moderation, of community involvement, but they have a high qualitative impact on the climate, the communication climate in the communities themselves. And the regulation, as I said, and only addresses actually these industrial models, but doesn't really see these kind of segments. Interestingly, I could notice in all the interviews I did, there was a structural neglection of the development of content moderation. But on the other, so they didn't put a lot of human resources there, but they did put, but not so many. But they also established a long-term complaint and reporting mechanism that the Network Enforcement Act then kind of imposed on big tech to do so. But they already had a lot of these measures that were legally now demanded from them, employed anyway, and they were already dealing with that, even though they were not part of this regulation. The question of, is that more democratic, was more an open question, but it was interesting that the management and the community organizing and putting the resources there really helped the company. And it kind of makes the difference from big tech companies. User courts were seen very critical. It was more if it comes from the users themselves, if they as a community want to establish, then the platform also kind of finds resources to help them to do so. But if it comes from outside, like a law or the regulation, it was seen very, very critically. And yeah, many of them lie on a qualitative level, which is very interesting, and it helps social cohesion. If we have new terms, if we have change of society, these community workers or moderators will sometimes go into discussion or interfere or even work more like a social worker in order to calm down the community, but keep the people also going. This is just a short overview. I will just not run through it, but because we usually look at the very large online platforms and what does the DSA now demand from them? Of course, now all small tech is also regulated under the DSA. And actually, there's a few points I want to just point you out. And here you see what is applicable to them, that there's specific things that they also have to do. So a small tech, interestingly, is now coordinated by the Digital Services Coordinator. And I also think there's a new opportunity for stakeholder arrangements to speak with these small tech companies, because they actually have to contribute something that hasn't happened, but is kind of something that I can see that would be interesting in maybe forming also other discussion than only with very large online platform who actually have to report to the European Commissions and not to the Digital Services Coordinator. So that's going to be something interesting. And they have a lot of more obligation, but often not the resources there, or they have to reorganize their resources, and it will be taken away from other things. And it's just because of the risk management, which is something that keeps everyone very busy, the risk assessments. It's also interesting because the risks can also come from very small platforms and from these niche platforms. I just give you here the Halle attack, which was actually posted and announced in a very, very small platform. So in a way, they carry also these risks, but they are not seen so much from the regulator in this side. If we look at small tech as an alternative, there is many questions. Interesting is, I think, what they can contribute. It makes them a bit alternative in a way of that there's just, it's not always organized around advertisement or money flow, because the community management and the communities themselves have a value, of course, because they generate user-generated content for free that makes the platform going. But they also do have the approach to ownership, to creating social norms, and also cohesion, social norm and cohesion learning. I have a very nice example I can give you about a social media platform in the segment of sex positivity, and it was very interesting. So there's very different concepts about what is a consent and what not, and how do we meet in relation, under what term of consent. So she described me that she has two different groups with very different sexual orientation that have very different concepts of consent, but they all work on the same platform. They are all part of the community. So they actually also help the community find an idea or a cohesional term that everybody can agree to, what is consensual and what is not. So that was a very interesting interview, and where I see that this cohesion about terms that are very society discussed, very decent. Civil society involvement is user community involvement. There is a different concept of civil society that lives on these platforms, that we still think of it very analogic and that is non-governmental organizations that create this, but actually there is a lot that these platforms create that would account under civil society and digital volunteering. These volunteer workers are visible and recognized. They are usually also appreciated with all kind of things, but it's unpaid. Small tech provides good practice for market competition and strengthens media diversity. That's actually also the idea why I did this research, because we cannot, the big tech anyway is hard to access for research and research data, but it's also interesting to look at these market segments on the side and to understand actually where social innovation happens. Because I had a very nice example of Yodel, which is a hyperlocal act that they did. They trialed this idea of two people having a conflict and then calling in a content moderator as kind of a video referee and trying to bridge the conflict, instead of having it as in your report line, and then you have to deal with it on a kind of ticket level, and it's very abstract, in order to solve the conflict with someone that they then offer to speak or to help bridging that conflict, instead of having many reports, but maybe not solving the social conflict or the misunderstanding, whatever it was. When users and user groups are involved in decisions making, that is what and when is that democratic or a democratic content moderation that is still open and negotiated. And one last thing is how penalties and sanction work is in order to change actually online behavior, is something that will be discussed in the future, and that small tech actually also can contribute alternative perspectives in so in order to work with accounts that were currently blocked, we have all this right to put back, and we give these individual rights to account that to understand why they're blocked or why they're taken down. But it's also the question of how maybe restorative justice can be done, how the community service can actually help the content moderation to find different solutions. And the interesting last thing is small tech is generally open to collaborate with science. I mean, I was able to conduct all these interviews. Mostly I just wrote the community part, and I asked them if they want to participate. And I barely had no problems in accessing them, which was also something that we don't find with big tech, and that makes it an interesting alternative. So that's it for now. I hand over to you, Alina. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Christina, for this very insightful presentation. I think we'll turn the floor over to Martin, and then discuss this presentation all together, right? Okay, Martin, please.
Okay, thank you for inviting me to participate. Let's see, you can see my screen here, hopefully. Yes. Okay, good. Well, thank you, Alina and Hig, also for inviting me. What I'm interested in, I want to just open up here, is a discussion of, in contrast to the previous presentation, big tech. And are there alternatives to big tech platforms? And so I'll go through a discussion here, and much of this work has been done with Susanna Schroeder-Berger, who I should have invited, but from Erlangen University. She's a graduate student, is looking at OpenStreetMaps, and we're trying to write some papers on OpenStreetMaps. But with that, let's start. Okay, let's see if this thing's going to work. Okay, so I'll just review some of the things that I'm sure all of you know. Platforms can be seen as a new organizational form, not a market, not a hierarchy, oh gosh, not a network. That's a typo, I'm sorry. Students late last night. And we need to think about them that way, because if they're a new organizational form, you know, we're pretty good at managing markets. I mean, pretty good, relatively. We've been doing it for a long time as governments, as societies, and hierarchies. We of course have a whole structure of laws for the labor law, et cetera, for managing hierarchies. Networks less so, but networks we've seen as sort of self-regulating, so we haven't actually tried to as much regulate networks. But, you know, as increasing sectors of the economy are organized by platforms, I'm just reviewing a paper on, it studies China, where a online platform has organized all of truck drivers, independent truck drivers, has organized them. And in the process of organizing them, they went from a relational management system to one that is managed by the platform. And as one might expect, the drivers, who are not workers but contractors, have been immiserated. Not only immiserated, their work processes changed. Okay, so we need to think about this. And since many of these platforms are winner take most, winner take all, they rapidly become both a monopoly in some senses, though it's not a market, and monopsony, because, you know, like Amazon, it both has very powerful control over the sellers, but also as we use Amazon more and more, it has more power over us, and it uses its power over us to feed us, as we know, various offers, and not the cheapest or the best offer necessarily, but the best offer for Amazon. And so they're powerful and able to exploit one or more sides. In a sense, they become taxation systems. You know, almost like the state taxes all of us. As they become dominant players, they tax all of us. And you know, this has many implications, right? For countries that don't have many of the big tech platforms, they're just being taxed. I did a back of the envelope calculation, and it appeared to me that Amazon, Google, with their sales in Europe, were approximately 1% of total European GDP was going through them. And I thought, well, that's great, because hopefully they're taxing. As they tax, they are extracting money from 1% of all of European GDP, and it may be greater than that. And of course, they become vital social infrastructure. And I think it's wonderful that we're looking at small tech or small platforms or whatever one wants. And these may be really quite important in aggregate. But, you know, many of these platforms have become vital social infrastructure, which means that 5 or 10 companies basically are becoming vital social infrastructure, vital infrastructure for ever greater parts of the economy. And, you know, if you think of how much of retail is now going through Amazon, how much of search and advertising is going through Google and Facebook, et cetera, one quickly becomes aware of the dimensions. Forward. Oopsie. Okay, so the question is, well, I guess for me, and maybe small tech is private ownership, and maybe that's a viable option. I hadn't thought of that, so it's wonderful that you brought that up. But are there viable options beside private ownership? You know, there have been many that are not significant, failed, or converted to for-profit, like couchsurfing.com, which I think is disappeared under the onslaught of Airbnb, etc. But you know, there may be many small tech platforms that are out there, but I'm not sure how important and powerful they are. Craigslist, which is owned by Craig, I'm blocking his name, but privately owned, but it's not expansive. It's been very stagnant. He doesn't do much to it. And most of it is free. So there's a private sector alternative that is not very exploitative, right? Wikipedia. And then open source street maps. And I'm going to talk a little bit about open source street maps. But what I'm trying to point out here is that there are alternatives. There are alternatives that are survived. And what can we learn from them? And can they be used, or what we learn from them be used against the dominant platforms, or not against them, that's a negative word, but to provide alternatives that might be successful. And the importance of these alternatives would be that they wouldn't be taxing society, which is what, you know, these dominant platforms are doing. They're massive taxers. Okay. So we have OpenStreetMaps, and if you see here, this is where the raw data is, down here. And one of the problems with OpenStreetMaps is that it does not build the various layers above it. It collects the data, it has some adequate layers, but you couldn't use it immediately on your smartphone, or you couldn't use it very easily, right? So you have, in many of these cases, you have alternatives, but they're perhaps not scaled up to become a competitor with the dominant two platforms, Google Maps being the dominant platform and Apple being the alternative. And there are some there's smaller ones in Europe, but these two have become globally dominant. So could one build on OpenStreetMaps a platform that could start to replace Google Maps? And let me just say, how does Google Maps, more than Apple, but they both invest in creating their maps and upgrading them, but they also use data from your phone, from your travel, to improve themselves, to give you traffic data, et cetera, right? Because they can sense this, for example, Android or Google. And one of the things, if you had a public open source street map, you could use garbage trucks, police cars, public government cars, as your source of information, and thereby increase privacy. Right? So I think is what governments could be thinking about, and I'll come to this later, is how to create public goods, right? Google Maps is a private good that we in the public use, and it extracts value from us. And there are already some solutions being developed. Overture is a club good development, as Facebook, Amazon, and all the other big platforms have become worried about being dependent on Google Maps or Apple Maps. They have started to build a layer so that they can contribute data into the open source repository here. What's happening, where are they going, et cetera, was the street busy, information about streets, et cetera. But they're building it for themselves, for private sector, for the big firms, not for us, right? So they're already a number of firms have gotten together to create a collective good for themselves from OpenStreetMaps. So the question that I would have as we think about this as an example is, could governments do this? Invest in creating an alternative map that could increase privacy by having, let's say, just public cars that are driving around, garbage trucks, et cetera, providing information to the, feedback information on the routes, et cetera, and thereby solve or address the privacy problem, and then address the platform power problem by creating a interface with the OSM data down here, such as the big boys, Amazon, Facebook, and all of the competitors of Google, or who are worried about Google or don't want Google to know what they're doing, are creating here at this level. So what we're doing here, and this is with Mark Huberty and others, and this is Mark Huberty and Claire Carthel's figure that I just pulled. What we're doing, trying to suggest, is that we can think of other alternatives to the big platforms. Okay. Now this is a timeline. Let's see, this thing in the way here of the quality and coverage of road map data in North America and Europe maps, Google Maps versus OpenStreetMap. And what you see is, over time, OpenStreetMap's quality is almost the same as Google Maps. I mean, we can debate it. Some people would say it isn't, but it's relatively close. The company Lyft, the company that competes with Uber, uses OpenStreetMap. They don't use Google Maps. Uber has developed its own mapping program that I'm sure underneath is OpenStreetMap, as it tries to escape from Google Maps monopoly, right? So, but for all of us, as we find things, we use most of us use Google Maps or Apple Maps. But we could use OpenStreetMap, but the OpenStreetMaps doesn't have the interfaces built up to our phones, the quality of the interface, right? Whereas what Lyft has done is it just it's a private company, it just built the software for itself. And that's what Amazon, et cetera, are doing. So what am I trying to point at here? What I'm trying to point at here is that there are already open source, in some sectors, there are open source alternatives, but they are put together by aficionados, people at night, et cetera, and they don't have the central planning that is needed to provide a product that's useful for everyone, or quasi-central planning. Could governments or states do this? If they could actually start to create public goods for their citizens and their small businesses. Because think about, you're a little restaurant in Heidelberg, Germany. You have a website. You have a map on the website. You probably have a Google map on the website. As I click that Google map to find out where your little restaurant is, you pay Google. It's a taxation on you. To be found, it will go into advertising, shall we say. And Google can change those terms and conditions for that at any time, i.e. to charge you more. You have to decide whether you'll be found or not. Right? Here, if the German government built on OSM down here and built that interface, they would free that restaurant of that cost. And, for that restaurant, I'm making a number up. It pays $50 a month. That's not a lot of money. I mean, for a small business, it is money, though. But think how many restaurants are there in Germany with a Google Maps on them? I mean, let's say there's 100,000. I'm sure that's too few. 100,000 times $50 a month. 100,000 times 50, that's 5 million. 5 million times 12 is $60 million. all of a sudden you go, oh my gosh, that money is all flowing out of German little businesses and flowing to Google. Is that good? You could say it's good. Google's an innovator and they deserve to be rewarded. You could say Germany is a country, and why should that money flow to Silicon Valley? Now, I'm in California. Thank you very much for sending the money to us. We appreciate that. But those are the kinds of issues that I think can be addressed here. So I'm going to wrap up here, but just using OSM as an example. And it's an example that is already ready for a collective action solution because Amazon and Facebook are creating a solution with it. So that means the state, your governments, could do the same things. Now, our government isn't going to do anything. I'm going to get an editorialize about Europe pretty soon, and you're not going to like it. But anyway, platforms are combinations of software and databases. There are a lot of open source databases out there that could be platformized. They're frequently created by amateurs and aficionados, but they aren't all. There's a great article in Strategy Science by Eric von Hippel and others, Potts, I think, David Potts, Eric von Hippel, in the last Strategy Science about open source databases and the strengths and useful of them, of those, and how they could be even increased and create more value by creating public goods. Because platforms are infrastructure. They're almost like your roads, like your water system, public goods. And we need to think of them that way. We have to stop thinking of them as just private firms. So the problem with many of this open source software and databases, it's not industrial strength or easily usable, right? Like Google Maps. And Google Maps is really great interface, easy to use, right? So if we rethink them as public goods, then governments could provide them as a service. And thereby disperse the centralization of wealth that comes from a Google Maps, right? Because the government doesn't have to make a profit, or it can make a small profit, etc., right? But what's needed is government investment in building up the layers and in adding new services. Because the other thing about Google Maps is, yes, it started out as a map, but now it has Street View, et cetera, et cetera. So, the government would need not only to invest one time, but it needs to curate it. It would need to continue to keep this going. And that's, what governments do well when they provide infrastructure. So, their governance, they would, of course, one would have to develop a governance system and funding and make decisions about that. Is it a quasi-public corporation? But I think that if the Europeans plan to play in the software and database world, in the platform world, they can't go the way they are now. Europe might, in a sense, become a good regulator, could be. But being a regulator doesn't generate value for your society, right? So I think these are the kinds of things that we need to think about as Europe starts to think about, does it want to develop capabilities? Because today, to be quite frank, and I'm so sorry to say this, Europe has very little capability in AI, big software, big platforms. You just don't have the capabilities because you don't do it. You don't have anything. This would be a way also building capabilities internally in Europe, right? So anyway, India is already doing things like this. I think as we look at how our country is going to respond to platforms, we really have to look outside the United States, which is not doing no response outside of, I really support Lina Khan very, very strongly. But outside of that, there's very little going on in the United States. And quite frankly, outside the regulatory space, there's not a lot going on in Europe. So where the action is increasingly is that fully privatized, neoliberal, the actions in the United States, and then in other countries, the actions India and China. Okay, with that, I will end. Hopefully, I've been provocative, and I've been provocative largely because I had hoped, I don't think it's probably going to happen, that Europe would have a different sensibility than the neoliberal sensibility that the United States has had. But I know neoliberalism has been very strong in Europe also. But I think there are possibilities here of positive, productive action by governments, be they Europe, be the EU, or individual countries like Germany, that not only would have sort of 2 or 3 outcomes. First outcome is you're not being taxed by platforms from outside your own countries. So that wealth is not leaving, that value is not leaving your country. 2, if you do something like this, because I don't think at this stage it's going to be possible for Europe to build up platforms that are true global competitors to the Googles and Facebooks. I think that ship has sailed. But could you build up open source platforms that could be successful? And you could mandate government agencies use them, et cetera, that would build capabilities within your countries, because I think that's really going to be the key, is building capabilities. And that, to some degree, of course, Europe has some skills in this area, but when one compares those to the United States or China, or even perhaps now India, one has to wonder, if those skills are enough to build for the future. So with that, I'll end. And I look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you very much, Martin. It's a very interesting talk. We are running, over time, unfortunately, but I didn't want to stop you at some point, because it was just, I think it generates a lot of, provokes a lot of thoughts in us, people who study European platform economy and the society. So thank you for inspiring us. Let's open the discussion. We have maybe like 10 minutes, 15 minutes for questions and answers. So there are many things that we can obviously talk about in these cases, in these presentations, but I think that maybe to be more on the pragmatic side, and like meeting the objectives that we have for this discussion series, maybe I would suggest thinking something between the lines of like trying to answer the question, what the suggested alternatives, what are these alternatives to, what are the alternatives to, right? So what are they planning to replace, or what the big tech, what are they failing to do? And what are the best practices in these alternatives? And also, how can they be integrated into like small tech, alternative tech, and some other solutions, rather than to the digital arrangements, platform arrangements that we are having today. Stefan, I see your hand. Please.
Thanks for the both presentations. I have also some questions. I don't know, should I start with you, Christina, or with Martin? Because I have questions for both of you, of course. Because maybe I could start with Christina, because I learned a lot about some platforms like Yodel platform. Maybe I have to try this kind of Yodel localized platform. But I'm always wondering, I mean, could we also speak a little bit about the perspective of the users? Because we all know all the theories and especially the effects of network effects. And I was wondering why, as a user, I should use some very local small tech platforms when I can use Facebook and connect with literally everyone in the world, which I sometimes do. And so my question is, how could we integrate the perspective of the users, and how could we motivate users to use small tech platforms? And that is maybe also a question for Martin, because you're absolutely right with the European perspective, and open source is probably a good way to build some new platforms, open source platforms in Europe, to provide this kind of infrastructure. But Europe has tried this several times, but the problem was always, sometimes it was too complicated, not user-friendly. And then another question was also, I mean, there was, for example, a cloud, open source cloud in Europe, or some open source cloud projects. But then the question was also, from a user perspective, is it better that Google has all my data, or is it better that, I don't know, the German government has all my data? That's also a serious issue. So I was wondering about this perspective, which is a kind of a user perspective.
Christina, do you want to go?
Yeah, I thought the whole time. I also have to say, Martin, I'm very involved with Wikipedia, and I'm a member of the board of Wikimedia Germany. So open source is very dear to me, and I see the potentials, but I also see it fading in the context of AI, as all these Alexa, Siri, they suck up Wikipedia or Wikidata content and just don't pay money for it and just generate profit from it. That's a huge problem in open source. Maybe we come to that later. But the user perspective, I thought of the Chaos Computer Club statement on these kind of ideas, and I thought it's not like from the perspective, also from a critical post-war German perspective, to have the state running an infrastructure that it can access data, sensible personal data, as you said, Martin. I think that will always block any effort in establishing it. It really needs to be independent in a way from state and state access. Because there's so much abuse in the history of Germany about surveillance and so on. I already could just see that moment coming. So from the user perspective, I think it's very important to give this moment again and against Entfremdung, like bringing this social cohesion together, feeling that this is your space. This makes the difference to a network where I can access everyone, but actually no one. Why people are in the internet? In my opinion, because there's other people in the internet. That's the whole reason, coming from this urban shapings, like why people are in the city, because of other people, even though we don't want to there is this need for social connection and social interchange that is written, and that's why small tech platforms are interesting, because they generate more this community sense, or this sense of belonging and ownership. So even if a big tech platform would address that more, they would probably be more successful. They just don't do it because it's not profitable from their perspective. That's what I think. And it's hard to exploit it also, or to extract from it. So Martin, I hand over to you. I'm very interested what you say about the role of the state.
Well, okay, so the role of, you could certainly, you'd have to think through all these. Now, the German state probably actually has access to all Google's information on you. My guess is they just ask for it and they get it, because otherwise the state could say you can't operate. So, but one could think of actually creating infrastructures like the Wikipedia board or something like that, that would create buffers between the state and the platform. So I mean, we're not incapable of thinking this through, but I guess the reason I've come to this, and maybe it's just my ideological and my hope, is that otherwise, I don't think DSA and DMA and all of that are going to address the fundamental problems that Europe has and that the world has, of these American platforms that are taxing the world and can turn you off at any time they want. And so, okay, bracket that. I think the small tech ideas are there small platforms that are already being developed in the small tech space that the state could incentivize and help grow? Because many of these are short of capital, is my guess. And if they go to venture capital, then they're in the neoliberal paradigm, because venture capital is there only for capital gains. There's no other goal. Venture capital has no other goal. Anybody who thinks it has any other goal is a fool. There's only one goal: to get more capital, right? It's neoliberalism on steroids. So you have, again, as Christina pointed out, you have these inventions, this bubbling of innovation down at the grassroots. A great state, a smart state, perhaps like Israel in the past. I'm not sure Israel's still a smart state, but it was a smart state, was looking for innovations that it could incentivize and build up. And that's why Israel has this strong tech sector. So, you know, there are possibilities here. And I think what we need to do, and hopefully the INCA project is going to do, is search for these possibilities that policymakers could use to develop a different system than this one, which is oligopolistic, monopolistic, extractive, and ever more extractive. And read about what percentage of the sales the Amazon takes from the sellers. It started at 5, 6, 8%. Now it's about 50%. Because it just squeezes them until right to before death. You don't want them to die. You want them just to be starving and working for you. It's the Junkers and the peasants in East Germany. Squeeze them as far as you can and then go have wars or do whatever the hell you please. So I think that that's what we need to be thinking about. And, you know, I don't know which states are thinking that way. I think India to some degree is thinking that way to protect its small business, and therefore trying to create an alternative to the Amazon and Walmart, Flipkart model. Will it succeed? I don't know, but it's trying. And in the process of trying, you build domestic capabilities, which is what Christina's talking about with these small tech. They're building capabilities, but they have to grow to be able to create some alternative. And maybe they have to grow in a way that doesn't let them become capitalized.
Or only like what we call soziale Marktwirtschaft in a social economic frame of the post-war Germany. That there is capitalism, but with social commitment and accountability.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully that will continue. I'm not sure that that's the path Northern Europe is on, but hopefully it will be that they will continue that path, or you will continue that path.
Okay, do you have another questions from the audience? Because I have a few reflections also on what's been said. Okay, well, thank you, Christine and Martin, for your very insightful thoughts. And there are just so many things that we can actually unwrap from these two presentations. It could take, you know, a whole entire kind of discussion series just based on this two presentations. So I'm thinking about the role of the community, that in both presentations, how they play out. And it's interesting that we actually started with the community and then ended up talking about the state as innovator, the state as an orchestrator and of this digital infrastructure that needs to be community-based. So could you maybe kind of elaborate on what do you think is the role of the community in your specific cases? Who should be the orchestrator of this digital infrastructure, and how the state, so we know about the state and how the state generally fails to be an innovator, especially in the tech sector. So what do you think about the state being in charge of this, you know, new technological infrastructures that are rapidly developing, rapidly innovating. Yeah.
Well, clearly in the United States, the state has been an enormous funder of these platform infrastructure through education, through research, et cetera. And then, of course, turned that knowledge over to the private sector, venture capital, et cetera, et cetera. It's harder for me to speak to Europe, but you do have other actors. You have cooperatives. You know, I mean, these are in different sectors, but can one start, you know, and what's his name wrote about platform cooperatives a long time ago. I'm blocking his name, in New York, NYU. And nothing ever happened, really. Things happened out of that, but they were sort of overwhelmed by the big platforms. I mean, the state has power also to weaken platforms, to provide alternatives, to say, for example, government officials cannot use X, Y, or Z. They must use this. Governments use taxation. They've used taxation for all sorts of policy purposes. So the community here, I mean, yes, community, but what is community without resources? And most of the time, communities' resources, if it's not a cooperative or something, come through the government, be it the local government, the state government, or the lender government, or the national government, or in Europe, you have the EU, which spends enormous amounts of money on stuff. And I can't figure out where the return is on it to the society. But anyway, I haven't done the research to be able to answer these questions well. And maybe Christina or Stefan or others in the audience can give us more insight into this.
But also what is interesting is that I think you have very different approaches to how the community, what community is in your presentations, because in what I understand from Christina's case is that this is an in-house decision, right? To build an internal infrastructure in these smaller tech companies, that because in-house is cheaper, and also it provides a better compliance with regulations, with the current regulations. And for me, the question is like, what is community, right? What is the community effort? And then in the case of open source, what Martin described is what is a community? Is it just a kind of individual user, donating the data? So is it the sense of community, or like what is the community in your cases? If we say that community efforts should be an alternative to existing digital platforms, as a monopolist, as a orchestrator of this infrastructure. So basically, with the community, we also propose the orchestrators of digital infrastructure that are also run through the complementers, through the community. Or am I missing something?
Martin, if I can, I mean, you said it so nicely that open source infrastructure is built by the community, and that through that, and I can just come from, I'm more from this Wikipedia, Wikidata thing, that of course it can create a high quality, but it can also, it lacks enormous amount of exploitation from the platform themselves. So if it's just community run, it's also sometimes it doesn't go into a specific phase of innovation. It's just happy with itself, feeding its community. And I think that's kind of something. And from Wikipedia, I can tell you, community get very closed up, very hermetic. Communities are not always open. They're not always democratic. There's specific things that we need to define about the community term and what we want. So I told you I was interested in democratic processes, and also the Wikipedia is full of it, but it's at the same time, it's a community which is very locked up and has a hard time opening up for new editors or for new contributors. And actually, if you personally ask me, the Wikipedia is going to die with 500 people eventually being too old, because they have a problem in letting in new people and innovation. So at one point, the community tips over. And it's interesting if I would be a platform that's not only open source, but I'm also orientated to innovation, and I do pay people to do that. I have the possibility of change and creating change. It's a lot of effort, but it's possible. It's more a social effort. And in the end, I sometimes, we talked about it, I always have great ideas. I have my students, but I sometimes see they're not ready for it. To create this kind of great work or research, it takes time to build up and to strengthen people, and with communities that work voluntarily, extremely. It totally depends on their abilities, and the capabilities are not there, like Martin, like you said. So these capabilities, I think they need to be paid, and they need to be resourced, and they need to be paid up. So in this sense, I totally agree with Martin. If you want healthy communities that kind of orientate and contributes, you cannot just let them sit on themselves.
The problem of keeping the community feeling and the community and paying, compensating people is difficult, but I mean, we should be able to solve this, I would think, but I haven't thought this through. It's just my reaction. But we need, I think we need the state, and it's remarkable to me that the Western Europeans states have not thought about this when they're completely in the thrall of the American platforms. I mean, it's true. I mean, there are small tech, but I mean, if you look at where the money's going, it's going out of Western Europe to the American platforms with their ideology. And I'm so surprised that, as you said, the post-war European social is nothing. And of course, the EU is a neoliberal creation that the Americans wanted to be part of NATO. Sort of those two go together. That this hasn't come. That regulation is the only thing that they're thinking of. Regulation's not positive. I mean, it's positive. I'm in favor of regulation, but it doesn't create value. Wikipedia creates value.
It's very, I would agree with you, and that's why I always think not penalties but incentives is extremely important. And the governments, at least for the German, they have not thought about it. You can see it with my small tech example, that they have developed it themselves, but they don't receive any kind of support.
Why aren't the local government saying this? It's keeping money here in the local. It's keeping the local community. What are they thinking of? I don't know. They just, but you have these local governments. They have resources. I mean, they aren't rich, but they have resources, and little bit of resources in these little small tech can have big impacts. And you can see which ones grow, which experiments have legs and can yield more community benefits. That seems to me the right. And the way the Europeans are going now is a dead end. It's a dead end. And the wealth will.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Stefan, do you have any questions, to comments, to reactions to this dark side of the platform innovations? And I just remember the literature on like the early phase, the early period of the of platform studies, you know, the literature on digital platforms, and how all the scholars in the early 2000s, they were very excited about the idea of open innovation and the idea of community engagement, that kind of creates another type of business model, another you know, way creating value, which in the end ended up being digital platforms. And I'm thinking now, after hearing your presentations and the discussion, it seems that these community efforts, I mean, I'm just questioning whether there's anything new to this particular arrangement that we're asking, you know, the community efforts, because it's been there for a long time. I mean, platforms are built their monopolistic position and the new organizational form because they attract complementers, they build partnerships, they generate data through, you know, integration with software, hardware, building user base, attracting users. So, and the community efforts actually a big part of the traditional, let's say, platform business model. So, but what I'm hearing now is that we don't really necessarily need the alternatives to platforms. We need alternatives to the orchestrators, that the digital platforms, right, who are now, as Martin says, taxing their users, taxing their communities, taxing the you know, societies, that now we need a different orchestrator. And you're suggesting that probably the state, given its power to control the infrastructure, to take care of the national level infrastructure, should be in the position, right? Am I getting this right? Or
it has resources. Who has resources? That's the point. Who has the resources? I'm sure Christina is seeing this in the small tech, is they're always strapped for resources. Is that correct, Christina?
Yes, and then they get the regulation on top, which binds even more of their little resources, in which they try to play to something that is actually not made for them, because it's made for hurting X or Google. You know, the European Commission had a specific idea with this regulation.
Yeah, I mean, these regulations, some people could say, are being implemented to strengthen the monopoly. That's not why they're being implemented, but that's what they're going to do. And unless resources go to the small,
indirectly they do create this dynamic, and they don't create diversity, and they don't take this into account in also thinking about innovation. They want to regulate, like you say, and maybe they do a good job in it, but they don't really think further than that, and that's a bit that's quite and that manifests then the whole. But that's also in the interest of the big platforms. You know, they just want to be the player. They're the ones who get invited. They show off. They are the ones who have to interact with the European Commissions. The other ones just get the digital coordinator, which is like the local authority for them.
I mean, how happy is Ursula von der Leyen when she's talking to the CEO of Google? She's there and she's grooving with him instead of, you know, what's really important.
I preferred more Thierry Breton and Elon Musk giving kind of an old teacher, and the young guy who the old teacher wants to tell him what to do, and the young guy, of course, who doesn't listen. Like you can see it from the picture of the press conference. But anyway, to go back to the small tech, I think it's interesting actually to put innovation there. I don't see the state really taking that into account, and the German state heavily has problems implementing digitalization in general. I mean, we're speaking about a health system that still relies on paper, because we cannot get certain data protective considerations through. We cannot. There was a case for lawyers to have I'm lacking now translating, but for the lawyers to kind of hand over postage and not to use faxing, but to use emailing, it's still also not so. So there's so much things lacking in infrastructure wise that I really don't see the state really getting into anything innovative if you deal with specific parts of administrative digitalization. Stefan, do I say it right?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. But sorry, Christina, I have another question which goes in a different direction, because I mean, I was really interested in this debate about the role of the government in regulation. And I was wondering about US regulation and platform regulation. I mean, of course, there are several attempts to regulate platforms, but I'm really familiar with the antitrust regulation and all these cases, Standard Oil in 1900, whatever, and DuPont, AT&T, and I think there was also a case with Microsoft. But are there any examples where the government regulated some US platforms with the antitrust regulation, or is there? I mean,
no, at this
point,
no. But I think if Lina Khan has her way, it's becoming more and more difficult for them to make acquisitions. And, the UK is also involved here. So, I mean, yes, there is some activity for sure. She's trying to push it. They're in court. But, the courts have been so infected by this neoliberalist ideology in the United States, they will probably rule against her. I think in some sense, the United States has the best government that can be bought, that can be paid for. So I don't think in the United States that leadership is going to be very great. Maybe some. I think. Let me put it again differently. In Europe, you're not even getting the advantage. You're getting the advantage of using the platform, but you're not getting the advantage of having the platform firms in your own continent. So you would expect more from Europe, but the question is, how should that be positive, not just regulatory? So in the US, I think Lina Khan is going to some degree, slow down the growth and mergers of the platforms. I think that's going to happen. I don't think they're going to break them up like they did Standard Oil. We don't have the pressure for that. That was the progressive era, right? We don't even have the pressure in the Microsoft case, which in the end was not broken up and got stronger than ever, right? So they regulated Microsoft and it just became stronger than ever. AT&T and IBM were regulated, but they missed the new technological revolutions, and so they became less important. The airlines were deregulated. Initially, a lot of entrants, and now there are fewer airlines than there were before deregulation. So I think thinking about antitrust as the direction is a good way to go, and I'm certainly in favor of it. But I think it's some other different path is needed, and maybe it's just not possible. But this path, Lina Khan, notwithstanding DMA, DSA, I don't think is going to give us a different configuration. That's going to have to come from somewhere else in a new model, and I just don't know. It's maybe just impossible. But I think that's what I see is, again, what Christina's talking about. Can we incentivize the innovation at the bottom and ensure that if it's successful, it doesn't just reproduce Google, it produces something else?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know.
There's this. Can I just give an example and then I think we finish up? But with this incentivize in Germany, there is a specific law that makes company with a specific amount of people force them into measurements of like employees with disabilities. So you can either pay your penalty that you don't change for wheelchairs, desks, and you don't employ people with disabilities, because you are obliged to with, I think, over 400 employees, or you can really do social change. Like that's the more what I'm interested in. So instead of saying incentives for those ones who really like want to do and want to participate and be the better and create change and be inclusive and be diverse, you penalize those ones who really don't want to do it. And if the cost is not high enough, they will not change. They will not change social behavior. They will not employ people with disability, but we want them to participate. And this is our approach in society. So the costs also need to be higher. And I think that brings me to the beginning, Martin, of this, the tax, the cost for these platforms, they just need to be higher. That I think the paying of the penalties won't change. It needs to be competition and incentives on the other hand.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Christina. Thank you, Martin. I think we should be wrapping up the discussion right now because we are running out of time, really. But I really want to continue the discussion, and I hope we can continue this, the question that we raised today in our next event, next sessions. I think it was very interesting to see like how we actually started with the community, right? Started to the community efforts in digital organizing, and kind of transition to the role of state, and what kind of state incentives do we need to support small tech, small companies, and what kind of state support do we need in general. Well, I thank you both for these wonderful presentations and for your great contribution in the discussion. And I look forward to seeing you all in our next meetings. Yes. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye. Have a good day, Martin.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.